Hello, and welcome to Session 2 of our study together. In this session, we'll be looking at some of the history of the Anglican Church of Canada's engagement with issues of human sexuality. It is our hope that we can come to an understanding of what has happened up to this point in time. This timeline gives us a glimpse of what has been happening in the Anglican Church of Canada and also in society generally over the past number of years. The Anglican Church of Canada has been discussing matters of sexuality, and particularly issues relating to homosexuality and same-sex relationships, since the mid-1970s. It is important for us to recognize that we are part of a conversation about sexuality that has been ongoing for about 40 years. In that time, the Anglican Church of Canada has issued some 25 official statements on the matter. These include commission reports, such as the St. Michael Report, statements from the House of Bishops, which provide us with theological as well as pastoral directives. And there have also been a number of resolutions from this General Synod, the official decision-making body of our national church. If you would like to see a full history of these statements, you may do so by visiting the national webpage at the address shown here, which will be provided for you in your handout. One of the earliest statements from the House of Bishops was in 1978, and it reflects the concerns that will continue to mark the nature of this ongoing conversation. Let me read it for you. We believe, as Christians, that homosexual persons as children of God have a full and equal claim with all other persons upon the love, acceptance, concern, and pastoral care of the Church. The gospel of Jesus Christ compels Christians to guard against all forms of human injustice and to affirm that all persons are brothers and sisters for whom Christ died. We affirm that homosexual persons are entitled to equal protection under the law with all other Canadian citizens. Now, in this quote, we will see some points of view that will be repeated in the statements that will follow. Note how it reaffirms that homosexual persons are children of God and have a full and equal claim upon the care of the Church. This statement also reminds us of the gospel call to work against all forms of injustice. As well, it calls upon the community at large and the government itself to protect, under the law, homosexual persons. It is important to note that the Church declared all people equal before God and insisted that homosexuals were entitled to equal protection under the law some 18 years before the amendments to the Federal Human Rights Code. In many ways, then, this statement can be seen as a prophetic one, where the Church calls the community as a whole to the truth of the gospel of Jesus Christ, which calls us to guard against all forms of human injustice. And the Church called upon the government bodies to ensure protection under the law for all Canadian citizens, including homosexual persons. It's significant for us to note the language used in this statement as well. This statement refers to homosexual persons. We'll note as we go forward how language around homosexuality changes over time. At this time, we still see a strong differentiation between homosexuals and homosexual activity. There are some important dates for us to note as we see this transformation in language. Many of us will remember that homosexuality was decriminalized in Canada in 1969, when Pierre Elliott Trudeau famously stated that the state has no business in the bedrooms of the nation. If we take this as our starting point, we will begin to see a change in our understanding and our language around homosexuality. Here we talk about homosexual acts, again highlighting the difference between the act and the person. Early statements reflect the notion that homosexuality was a deviant behavior committed by homosexuals who were considered to be disordered in some fashion. With the change of the law in 1969, homosexual acts were no longer considered criminal, and the idea that the sexual relationship between adults was not the concern of the state was introduced. This is the beginning of questioning the assumption that homosexuality is in and itself deviant or criminal. In 1974, the American Psychological Association declassified homosexuality as a mental disorder. In doing so, it acknowledges that it is an orientation. So now, a person who is homosexual by orientation is no longer considered a criminal or a mental health patient. In 1977, well ahead of the national government, Quebec includes sexual orientation in its Human Rights Code. We should also note that this is 1 year before the statement of our own House of Bishops. In 1979, a very significant report is released in the Church of England. The Gloucester Report declared homosexuality as an orientation and as distinct from both disorder and choice, and so saw it not as an act of sinful behavior. This is a major theological development, because in saying that this is not a choice or a disorder, and therefore not an act of sin, raises the question of what is natural. A lot of the argument from both the theological tradition and from Scripture have been around the understanding of natural and unnatural acts. This report calls into question the assumption that homosexuality is in and of itself an unnatural act. One should note that this is not the prevailing idea in the Church at the time, and the Church continued to teach abstinence for those who saw themselves as having a homosexual orientation. In 1979, the Anglican Church of Canada House of Bishops resolution recognized as well the concept of orientation, but continues to distinguish it from same-sex activity, which remains unaccepted and called for, and the Church continues to call for, abstinence for those who see themselves as homosexual. Okay, so keeping all of these changing ideas in our mind, let us go back to the statements from the Anglican Church of Canada. While as Anglicans we do consider the changing ways of thinking and processing in our society, we are primarily led in our decision-making by Scripture and how it has been lived in the community of faith, tradition. While there are points that diverge in these statements, there are certain things that are very consistent. And these are statements that are generally acknowledged across the Church that are scripturally based in their appeal. So if we look at these statements from 1978 to 2007, we see that they're consistent in their appeal to Scripture and in stating the following: that all are created in the image of God, that all are children of God, and that the gospel of Jesus Christ calls us to act as a community of faith in the pursuit of justice. Now there remains much division about how one lives out these statements and how the church should pastorally respond to persons of various sexual orientations, but on these scriptural points there seems to be much agreement. In the 1997 Human Sexuality Statement from the House of Bishops, they reiterated much of what has been said in other statements. It affirms the full membership in the Church of homosexuals, calls for continued study and conversation, and accepts all persons, but does not accept same-sex unions. This study identifies 4 key areas of consideration. It says that the Church's statements can be grouped into 4 main areas. The first is gays and lesbians in society. In this area, statements have expressed concern for equal rights and protection under the law. The second area of concern was for gays and lesbians in the church. Now, this is very important for us to recognize. But while the church called the general society into expressing concern for the equal rights and protection, and very concerned for those who have been harmed by hatred towards homosexuals, there has been a time within the church when we talked about homosexuals as if they existed outside of the church. Statements affirming gays and lesbians in the church saw them as children of God and began to recognize that they were contributing members of the church. So no longer could we as church talk about them as outside of the church. But in all of our conversations, we are being called to recognize that gays and lesbians are obviously present. As we begin to affirm gay and lesbian persons within our church, we are brought to some conversations around what do we do about same-sex relationships? How do we enter into conversation and dialogue about these relationships? Because if we affirm that there are gays and lesbians who are contributing members of our church, and we acknowledge that they are in same-sex relationships, and as such are contributing to the church, then we have to ask ourselves questions about the integrity of these relationships. In what ways are these relationships a sign of God's blessing? And which ways do they enable people to actually live out their faithful ministry? If we are called to recognize gays and lesbians as members of our church, and we recognize that many of them are in healthy relationships, then what do we call these relationships? This has been a major struggle for our church. Another area of concern has been around the ordination of gays and lesbians. It has long been a practice that gays and lesbians were ordained within the church as long as they would promise to their bishop that they would remain celibate. As long as we as a church do not have a means to bless or affirm relationships or call same-sex relationships into the covenant of marriage, it is difficult for those who are gay or lesbian to be in a relationship and to be ordained. As a part of their ordination vows, they are called to live their lives in a very particular way. And so while heterosexuals are obliged to live their lives in a particular way and to become married if they wish to live as in a monogamous lifelong relationship, then what do we do with those who are gay or lesbian and also feel so called? These last 2 questions are really the questions that seem to bring much division within our church. While we can come to great understanding and an agreement on people being treated with equal rights and people being created in the image of God and having a voice and participation within the church, how that is actually lived out in terms of our own sacraments, of marriage and of ordination become very difficult for us. So when we look at the statements from the Anglican Church of Canada, we can see a change of language and also of content. From activity, questions about homosexual acts, to understanding of homosexuality as an orientation, to now our contemporary conversation about even the possibility of marriage. The initial statements from the Anglican Church of Canada did not entertain the question of committed same-sex relationships, but rather focused on chastity. These statements called for protection under the law and for acceptance of homosexual persons, but they were very clear that that was the extent of what our call as Christians was towards homosexual persons. It affirmed traditional understanding of marriage and of sexuality, and an understanding of homosexuality as essentially disordered or unnatural in some sense. Later, as conversations unfolded and studies were held, the Church began to discuss the possibility of a liturgy of some kind that would recognize a same-sex committed relationship. This followed out of the understanding and recognition that there were many people in such relationships who were already actively contributing to our Church. These conversations challenged our understandings, and as studies began to see homosexuality as an orientation and not as a choice, these conversations led as well to questioning how we might as church recognize in some way these members of our community. In 2004, the St. Michael Report, which was commissioned by the General Synod to look at the blessing of same-sex relationships, suggested that such a blessing would be so close to marriage that it would need to be understood within the doctrine of marriage. And so we've come now to this place where we are discussing if it is possible for us to understand the doctrine of marriage to include persons of same-sex orientation. In 2005, the Canadian Civil Marriage Act was passed. This states now that whereas in order to reflect the values and tolerance, respect, and equality consistent within the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, access to marriage for civil purposes should be extended by legislation to couples of the same sex. Article 2 states, marriage for civil purposes is the lawful union of two persons to the exclusion of all others. Article 3 states, it is recognized that officials of religious groups are free to refuse to perform marriages that are not in accordance with their religious beliefs. So since 2005, persons of the same gender are able to civilly marry within Canada. This act also protects religious groups from having to perform such marriages. So while this is possible within the civil marriage, it is not possible within all religious groups for marriage. So what have we learned in this session? Well, I hope we've learned that when the Church, particularly the Anglican Church of Canada, begins a discernment process around an ethical matter, it is a very long and complicated process. As we've already stated, we've been engaged in this discussion for over 40 years. Part of this discussion requires us to have discussions within the Church with one another, to make sure that all voices are heard, but also for us to engage with the larger society around us and with the Anglican Communion around the world. It also must consider the witness of Scripture, tradition, and reason. recognizing that these things are not easily or simply delineated from one another. In our next session, we will talk more about the importance of these three things, Scripture, tradition, and reason, in decision making, and how as Anglicans we must consider all three